The glass shattered against the wall the moment Alina Hartley stepped into the study, and Duke Alexander Whitmore turned to face her with fire in his eyes. "Your family has ruined me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I would sooner marry a stranger off the street than ever bind myself to a Hartley." Alina did not flinch. She stepped over the broken glass and looked him straight in the eye. "Good," she said, "because I would rather die alone than spend one single day as your wife." Behind her, the door remained open, and through it walked her father, Edward Hartley, a merchant with a folder of legal papers under his arm and a satisfied look on his face. He had waited years for a seat at the table with the Whitmore family, and now, through a disputed patch of land, he finally had one. The land in question sat between the two estates, a stretch of hills that held a mineral deposit both families needed desperately. Edward had signed papers weeks earlier that gave him a legal claim to half of it. Alexander's lawyers called it theft, dressed up as opportunity. The court disagreed, ruling that both families had to send representatives to negotiate a settlement before the matter could go any further. Alexander expected Edward himself. Instead, Edward sent his daughter, certain she was the only one in the family sharp enough to hold her ground against a duke, who was famous for crushing anyone who challenged him. Alina had grown up listening to her father's stories about the nobility, about men like Alexander who inherited power without ever earning a single ounce of it. She walked into that study prepared to be underestimated, and she was right. Alexander barely looked at the papers she handed him before tossing them onto his desk. "I do not negotiate with merchants' daughters," he said. Alina picked the papers back up and set them down again, directly in front of him. "Then you can explain to the court why you refused a legal proceeding," she answered. Alexander's jaw tightened, but for the first time in a long while, someone had left him without a quick response. Word of the confrontation spread through both households before the sun set. Alexander's mother, Margaret, heard of it from a servant and found her son standing alone by the window of his study, still staring at the papers Alina had left behind. "You cannot fight this in silence," Margaret told him. "The court has already decided you will deal with her directly." Alexander said nothing, but the memory of Alina's steady voice, unshaken by his title or his temper, stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. Across the valley, Alina sat across from her father at their dinner table, describing the Duke as cold, arrogant, and utterly convinced of his own importance. Edward listened with quiet satisfaction. "Then you are exactly the person to deal with him," he said. Alina did not feel flattered. She felt trapped. She had sworn, standing in that study, that she wanted nothing to do with Alexander Whitmore ever again. Yet the court's ruling meant she would see him again within days, whether either of them wanted it or not. Neither of them could have guessed how quickly that forced meeting would change everything they believed about each other, or how little time it would take for two people who despised each other to become impossible to separate. The negotiations were set for the following morning, on the very land that had started the entire dispute. Alina barely slept that night, rehearsing every argument she might need. Alexander stood at his window until the candles burned low, telling himself this was simply business, nothing more. Neither of them knew it yet, but the walk they were about to take together across those disputed hills would become the first step toward 5 days that would change both their lives forever. The morning was cold and bright when Alina arrived at the boundary line, dressed for walking rather than sitting in a drawing room. Alexander was already there, arms crossed, clearly expecting her to be late. She was not. For the next several hours, they walked the disputed hills together, arguing over every stone wall and fence post, each one determined not to yield an inch. Alina had studied old land records long into the night and could recite boundary markers from memory. Alexander, used to advisors who agreed with him out of fear, found himself oddly unsettled by someone who simply refused to back down. By midday, their argument had shifted from legal claims to something more personal. Alina accused him of caring more about pride than fairness. Alexander accused her family of using the courts to steal what they could not earn honestly. Neither backed away from the exchange, and neither noticed the clouds building over the hills until the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, the sky opened into a full storm, and lightning split across the horizon close enough to make Alina jump. Alexander grabbed her arm without thinking and pulled her toward an old hunting cabin near the tree line, the only shelter for miles. They reached the cabin soaked through and breathless, laughing despite themselves at how quickly the argument had been forgotten in the scramble to survive the weather. Alexander built a fire while Alina wrung water from her sleeves, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence was different than before. It was not hostile. It was simply quiet and strangely comfortable. Alina was the first to break it. She asked, without any of her earlier sharpness, why he hated marriage so deeply that he would announce it to an entire room of strangers. Alexander hesitated, staring into the fire before answering. He told her about a betrothal from years earlier, one arranged by his family, one he had actually looked forward to, until his intended left him days before the wedding for a man with a smaller title but a warmer heart. The humiliation had followed him ever since, whispered about at every gathering he attended. Alina listened without interrupting, and when she finally spoke, her voice held none of the mockery he expected. "That was not your failure," she said. "That was hers." Alexander looked at her then, truly looked at her, and realized he had spent the entire day assuming she was exactly like every other person who wanted something from him. She was not. She had not once asked about his title or his fortune. She had only asked about him. In return, he asked about her own life, about growing up watching her father fight for a place among people who never fully accepted him. Alina admitted she had built her sharp tongue as armor long before she ever met a duke, because being underestimated was easier to survive than being ignored. The storm passed faster than either of them wanted it to. When they finally stepped outside, the hills were washed clean and glowing under a pale afternoon sun. They walked back toward the estate boundary in a silence that felt entirely different from the one that morning, comfortable rather than tense, thoughtful rather than guarded. Neither mentioned the land dispute again that day. When they reached the point where their paths would separate, Alexander found himself reluctant to say goodbye, a feeling so unfamiliar that it unsettled him more than any legal argument ever could. Alina felt it too, though she would not have admitted it aloud for anything in the world. 2 days remained before the court required a final agreement on the land, but neither Alexander nor Alina could have predicted that the real negotiation happening between them had nothing to do with property lines at all. Alexander could not stop thinking about the cabin. For 2 days he told himself it meant nothing, that any two people trapped together in a storm would talk more freely than usual, that it changed nothing about who Alina Hartley was or what her family had done. Yet when a servant announced that Alina had arrived for their scheduled meeting regarding the final land agreement, he found himself standing before he even realized he had moved. Alina noticed the change immediately. He no longer spoke to her with the same clipped coldness. He asked her opinion before dismissing an idea, and twice he caught himself smiling at something she said before quickly straightening his expression. She told herself it did not matter. A duke's manners meant nothing when his family had spent years trying to push hers out of every room that mattered. Yet she also found herself lingering longer than necessary over the papers spread across his desk, finding reasons to extend a meeting that should have ended an hour earlier. That evening, Alexander did something he had not done in years. He invited Alina and her father to dine at the estate, framing it as a gesture of goodwill meant to smooth the final negotiation. Edward accepted immediately, sensing an opportunity too valuable to refuse. Alina suspected her father was right to be pleased, but for entirely different reasons than he assumed. Dinner began stiffly, with polite conversation about the weather and the harvest. But as the evening wore on, Alexander found himself drawn into conversation with Alina that had nothing to do with land or lawsuits. She spoke about a school she hoped to help fund for children in the village near her family's estate. Alexander listened with genuine interest, offering suggestions about funding structures that surprised even himself with their thoughtfulness. Margaret, watching from across the table, exchanged a quiet glance with Edward, both of them noticing something neither of their children seemed ready to admit. After dinner, Alexander walked Alina and her father to their carriage. As Edward climbed inside, Alexander lingered beside Alina for a moment longer than necessary. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. Alina met his gaze steadily. "I was wrong about you too," she admitted. Neither of them said anything more, but the walk back into the house felt heavier to Alexander than any conversation he had had in years. The following morning, disaster arrived in the form of a visiting cousin named William, a man with his own ambitions toward the Hartley family fortune, and a long history of resentment toward Alexander for inheriting a title William had once hoped to claim through a distant relation. William had heard rumors of the growing closeness between Alexander and Alina, and he saw in it an opportunity to cause damage to both families at once. He began quietly spreading a story, twisting the truth of the storm and the cabin into something scandalous, suggesting Alina had used the moment deliberately to trap the Duke into a compromising position for her family's benefit. By afternoon, the story had reached every household in the county. Alina's reputation, already fragile due to her family's disputed rise in status, was suddenly the subject of open ridicule. Alexander heard the rumors within hours and felt a fury unlike anything he had experienced in years, not at Alina, but at the injustice being done to her because of a moment that had meant something real. Yet even as his anger grew, an old fear crept in alongside it, the same fear that had haunted him since his broken betrothal. What if getting close to someone always ended in public humiliation? What if trusting Alina was simply another mistake waiting to be exposed? Alina arrived at the estate that evening, furious and hurt, demanding to know whether Alexander had done anything to stop the rumors from spreading. He hesitated, caught between his growing feelings and the old wound reopening beneath them, and in that hesitation, Alina saw exactly what she feared most. She turned and walked away before he could find the words to answer her, leaving him standing alone in the same study where their story had begun 5 days earlier, now facing the very real possibility that he had let it end there as well. Alexander stood frozen in the study long after Alina's carriage disappeared down the drive, replaying every second of their conversation and hating himself for the silence that had cost him the one honest thing he had felt in years. Margaret found him there an hour later, still staring at the door. "You hesitated because you were afraid," she said gently, "not because you doubted her." Alexander did not argue. He knew his mother was right, and he knew that if he did not act immediately, the fear that had shaped his entire life would win again, exactly as it had 5 years earlier. He rode through the night to confront William directly, arriving at his cousin's residence before dawn and demanding he retract the story publicly or face consequences that would end any hope William had of remaining welcome in polite society. William, unwilling to lose his own standing over a rumor built on nothing but jealousy, reluctantly agreed to correct the story the following morning. Alexander did not wait to see it done. He rode straight for the Hartley estate instead, arriving just as the first light broke over the hills. Edward met him at the door, unsurprised by the visit. "Alina does not wish to see anyone," he said, though something in his expression suggested he was not entirely opposed to the interruption. Alexander asked for 5 minutes, and something in his voice, raw and stripped of all the coldness that once defined him, convinced Edward to allow it. Alina stood in the garden when Alexander found her, her arms crossed, her expression guarded in a way that reminded him painfully of their very first meeting. "I came to apologize," he said, "not for the rumor because I did not create it, but for hesitating when you needed me to defend you without a moment's doubt." Alina said nothing, waiting. Alexander continued, his voice steady despite the way his heart pounded against his ribs. "5 days ago, I swore I would never marry anyone, and certainly never someone from your family. I meant it when I said it. But every single thing I believed about you was wrong, and every day since has proven it wrong again and again." Alina's arms slowly uncrossed, though she remained silent, waiting for him to finish. "I do not care what the rumors say," Alexander continued. "I do not care what my title requires or what your father expected when he sent you to negotiate on his behalf. I care that you are the only person who has ever spoken to me without wanting something from my name, and I care that the thought of losing you terrifies me far more than any scandal ever could." He paused, then lowered himself onto one knee in the middle of the garden, ignoring the damp grass soaking through his clothes. "I swore I would never marry," Alexander said, looking up at her with none of the coldness that had once defined every word he spoke. "5 days later, I am asking you to prove that vow wrong. Marry me, Alina, not because of land or family or anything either of our fathers wanted, but because you are the first person who ever made me want to try." Alina stood in stunned silence for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes as she finally understood that the man kneeling before her had nothing left to hide behind. No title, no pride, nothing but the truth. She knelt down until she was level with him, took his face in her hands, and said the only word that mattered: "Yes." Behind them, Edward watched from the doorway with a smile he could not hide, while somewhere across the valley, the rumors William had spread were already being forgotten, replaced by a far better story, one about a duke who swore he would never marry, and a woman who proved him gloriously wrong in just 5 days.